Hello and welcome as we come to the third week of Easter. The readings for this time, to begin with right away, first one comes from the book of Acts, chapter 5, verses 27 through 32, and then verses 40b through 41. The second reading from the book of Revelation, chapter 5, verses 11 through 14. And the gospel this time is from John, chapter 21, verses 1 through 19. Now, it's generally believed by many of the scholars who look at the New Testament, particularly at the Johannine work, that chapter 21 of John's Gospel is an appendix. In fact, if one remembers that last week, when we looked at the story of Thomas being with the disciples on that 8th day after Easter, that the writer had said, many other things are written in this book that Jesus has done, many other things Jesus did, but these are written down that you may come to believe. And so when you look at the end of chapter 20, it looks like an appropriate ending to the work. Now we come to chapter 21, a resurrection story of Jesus that stands really by itself. And although it certainly has an important place to offer in the tradition of John, I mention all of this so that you will know. And keep in mind that as we're doing this, we are looking at things from a scriptural point of view, from how scholars or those who look at the New Testament kind of notice things and bring to our attention. So I give all of this as background. And how does it begin? The episode begins by the disciples, at least 7 of them, being in the Galilee. And Peter says that he is going fishing. Now, the others who are with him are named. Namely, we hear that along with Peter, there is Nathanael. Now you remember Nathanael, and some of these, the figures had been, of course, introduced in the tradition of John. Nathanael had been, in the early part of John's story, had been one who had come and brought the story of Jesus to his friend. Then there was Thomas. Of course, we heard Thomas last time, and he would be included. The 2 sons of Zebedee. This is the first time that we are introduced to, and they are not named, but because of the synoptic tradition, we know that these are James and John, and that they were brothers and that they were fishermen. And then 2 others who are not named. Now, when we put it together, it produces 7. And 7, of course, is that important number used in scriptural tradition. May be, and here's where interpretation of this number takes place by those who look at this, a representation of the future Christian church community as a whole. So 7 is the complete number, and so that may be one of the reasons why the writer has carefully articulated this number of persons. We would not have known, if we had not had the synoptic tradition, that the boys were capable of being fishermen, okay? Now, because of the synoptic tradition, one remembers that Jesus had called Peter and Andrew, James and John, and that they were identified as fishermen. And in fact, Jesus had said to them, "Come and I will make you fishers of men." Now what we do is we read into the Johannine tradition material that we get from the other 3. Understandable, but important to take the Johannine tradition as it is. All right. So those are the guys, and apparently Peter says, I'm going fishing, and they go with him. Okay, say, well, we'll go fishing with you. Now, why they're in the Galilee, we don't know. Of course, again, going back to the synoptics, that in one of them, Jesus had told the women, go tell the disciples that they will see me again in the Galilee, and where the story had begun. So what had happened between the time that we heard last week, the disciples, that is, in the upper room, commissioned by Jesus to bring the message to others, and now why they're in the Galilee again, we really don't have clear answers, and it might be interesting, and here's a comparison that some have made. And while we're at it, who were those two unnamed disciples? Now, one of them, because we're going to meet him in the boat scene that unfolds, is sometimes believed to be the beloved disciple. Well, maybe, but why then would he have not been mentioned? Because very carefully in this gospel, the beloved disciple is named by the writer. Remember that it's only in this gospel that we are introduced to the beloved disciple. He is there at the supper, he is there at the foot of the cross, and he is one of the two who run to the empty tomb on Easter Day, and it is the beloved disciple, you remember. He gets there first, he waits for Peter. Now we're going to come to this because this episode is really about Peter in many ways, and that's the importance of this story. All right, and but anyway, the beloved disciple enters after Peter does into the tomb and came to believe. What did he come to believe? Well, we assume he came to believe that the empty tomb represented, in fact, of the cloths wrapped up in a nice way and set in the appropriate place in the tomb, that Jesus had been raised. Did the beloved disciple believe that? Well, that's a certainly possible tradition, but we don't know. Now, one of the concerns here is that the beloved disciple sometimes appears to be superior to Peter. And there are ways in which this certainly makes some sense. The beloved disciple, when Jesus is arrested, so going back to that episode, remember that when Jesus is arrested and taken to the place of the high priest, follows Jesus, follows them, okay, and also following behind is Peter. The beloved disciple, when Jesus is arrested, enters with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Peter is pictured as standing outside the gate. The beloved disciple comes, speaks to the woman who is the guard of the gate, and says that, Peter's all right, and please let him in. And so she lets him in. Now, some have seen, and that what we are looking here at is, and always there are interconnections between earlier parts of the Gospel of John, where Jesus had pictured, and we will get more of this to look at in upcoming weeks, but Jesus is pictured as the shepherd. And remember that the good shepherd is the one who takes care of his flock. The good shepherd is the one who guards the entrance to the place where the sheep are. Good shepherd is the one who is willing to lay down his life for his sheep. Therefore, we say good shepherd, but let us say also the noble shepherd. Is the one enters by the door, is the gatekeeper because the sheep recognize the shepherd, and he leads the sheep in or out. So the good shepherd, that's his role. Now, what happens here is the beloved disciple at this story of the arrest of Jesus acting as the noble shepherd. He enters to where Jesus is going to be judged by the door. The gatekeeper, the woman, recognizes him and lets him in, and he leads the sheep in. Now, in this case, Peter is not the shepherd, but rather he is the lowly sheep. Peter also could be considered, remember that in another place in this same episode, Jesus had said that the hireling would flee when some animal would come, maybe a wolf or something else, because he was not devoted to the sheep. His devotion was rather to making sure that his own self was saved. So, in this case, is Peter considered to be the hireling rather than the disciple? He lacks knowledge of the traitor. He needs the beloved disciple to let him in. Peter, later on, so what I'm kind of saying here is there's a contrast, between the beloved disciple and Peter, and Peter comes out on the short end of things, okay? So the beloved disciple seems to be the one who gets it right, and Peter doesn't. All right. So all of that is another way in which some interpret things here, that this episode is designed to reestablish the importance of Peter. So keep that, we keep that in mind, and often that's where the emphasis is. But I did want to kind of point out this interconnection about shepherding, about the role of the beloved disciple, whom we really never ever get to know his name, but seems always to be the good guy. And could it be that this particular episode wants to reaffirm the importance of what others knew, that it was Peter who was the one designated by Jesus to carry on and to continue the mission of the risen Lord? All right. So here we are. They are in a boat fishing, and it is dark. And again, this is a traditional image that is used by John. Dark always means one doesn't know, one is kind of in the unknowing, etc. They fish all night and catch nothing. Then as dawn comes, so light, remember in this gospel, there standing on the shore is this figure. Darkness, light, Jesus, the light of the world. All of these images, of course, are in some ways at work. Says, how did you do? Well, obviously they have caught nothing. Well, says the man on the shore, cast your net to the other side of the boat, and they do, and they get this amazing catch, okay? So much so that the boat is full, even so they need to get the others to help them. So this story of the miraculous fish catch, you remember, is also found in this story remembered by Luke. So that's why some wonder whether this is a resurrection story, which is placed here, or whether or not it really belonged earlier on in the ministry itself of Jesus. Again, that is a discussion that goes on in this regard. The beloved disciple, now here's where he comes into play, recognizes that this is Jesus. He says this to Peter. Peter, catching on, jumps into the water. He is lightly clad, so I guess he kind of, whatever, I don't know how he got his clothes to stay on, but jumps into the water, which, however, and the rest follow, is not that far from shore. It isn't that Peter has to swim a great distance, but that he is there. All right, so now the disciples are all there, and as this episode continues, Jesus invites the disciples to a breakfast, okay? So there is a charcoal fire. Now keep in mind, we're going to come back to the importance of the charcoal fire. Where did we see a charcoal fire before? You go back to the story where Jesus is being tried and Peter is gathered in the center where this is happening around a charcoal fire, where the recognition of Peter takes place. Certainly you are one of his disciples. No, I'm not. Why, even your accent gives you away. No, I'm not part of this. Well, certainly, and remember that this goes on all around this fire as those who are sitting there go through this discussion. Finally, Peter says, no, I don't know the man. And, of course, the cock crows as Jesus had predicted. So, if you want, denial on the part of Peter that he knew Jesus takes place around a charcoal fire. Interestingly, we don't know what the disciple whom Jesus loved said or did because it's never brought to our attention at this point. The assumption is he remained loyal, but it's simply an assumption if you want to follow that along. All right. Now, Jesus says he's got some bread and some fish, but he says, bring some of the fish that you caught here for us to eat. Now, I guess it's Peter who goes to the net, and the observation is made that there are 153 large fish that have been caught. Now, I don't know how that number came about. Well, we don't know, the experts. Can you imagine Peter sitting there as Jesus says, bring me some of the fish. Now, wait a minute, Lord. We want to see how many we caught here. 1, 2, 3. Or was it just an interesting guess? Or did it not matter? Was the number 153 somewhat kind of drawn out of the hat? All right, there's a large number there. Others throughout the tradition, and you probably have noticed this and heard this, will say, well, the 153 represented the fact that at that time there were 153 known varieties of fish in the world. Now, I don't know who kept a record of that, and again, it sounds good, but where did that come from? Another would say there were 153 different nations or nationalities, and so therefore what the apostles have captured in that net are all of the nations and people of the world. Again, who was keeping records like this in the first century? Were they even important? So And if you can go home and go on Google and see what you can get in terms of what is the symbolism of the 153. Some, in the end, say it's the capacity of the church to hold a multitude of people in unity under Peter. And this is important because now this episode is establishing the significance of Peter as the leader of the developing community of Jesus, who has now risen and ascended back to the Father. All right, so they have their breakfast, their fish breakfast with Jesus. Now, some again say this story could stand by itself. It was introduced here. But it does have a logical connection with what takes place next. After the supper, after they have eaten, Jesus then poses the question to Peter, and it becomes, as I mentioned, really there are two main divisions to this episode: the breakfast, which we have heard, and now the rehabilitation of Peter, which is the second part. But in leaving certainly the breakfast scene, notice that there was an abundance of fish, okay? Certainly they didn't need them all. That would be another point to see, that there probably were obviously leftover fish. Remembering stories going back to chapter 6 of John's Gospel, where, and of course the same story is told in the other three synoptics, of Jesus feeding a large number of people, and there was food left over. So again, are there some connections here? Is there some connection of this story in John's Gospel to the first sign that Jesus worked? What was the first sign that Jesus worked in John's Gospel? It took place at Cana of Galilee. You remember, this goes back almost to the very chapter 2 of John's Gospel, where Jesus and unnamed disciples of Jesus are at the meal. So we don't know, at the wedding feast, okay? And everyone knows this story. They run out of wine. Mary says, do whatever he says. The 6 water jugs of water turn into wine. Again, a superabundance. There certainly was a lot of wine left over, if you remember the height and depth of the water jugs that had now become an important wine. So is there a connection here, that there was a surplus in this opening sign that Jesus performed of the graciousness of God, and now this concluding sign in the story of John, where there's a leftover, a number of leftover foods of fish for whoever was going to get it. So again, some see perhaps this story as bookending, if you want, the signs that Jesus worked. As I say, there's a number of different ways in which people kind of enjoy interpreting this particular chapter of the Johannine work, and so I mentioned that to you. All right, now Jesus says to Simon Peter, we assume the others are standing around. We don't really hear much of what goes on. And everyone is sort of familiar with what happens here. Jesus says to Simon Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, well, yes, Lord, I do love you. Feed my flock, feed my sheep, feed my people. Do you love me? He says the second time. Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Okay, feed my sheep. Third time, Simon Peter, do you love me? Now, interestingly, Peter is kind of pictured, and you can understand if, how many times do you have to say something before people get it? That might be another issue here. Peter says, well, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Now, important here is the fact that Jesus now commissions Peter to be the leader. He does not, and I think that's in this triple interrogation of Peter, there is no recrimination that Jesus makes to Peter about what he had done, no mention of his failures, and not even an experience of forgiveness. Jesus doesn't even forgive Peter for what he has done. So I think that's a kind of interesting thought. I think we mentioned this, but just point out that all of this took place around a charcoal fire. Remember that charcoal fire earlier on when Peter had said, I don't know Jesus. Now, charcoal fire in which Peter is commissioned to be the leader for the people. Earlier on, after all, he said, Simon, son of John, I call you now Peter, which I mean rock. So it's a beautiful scene, and that is why we believe that it was incorporated into the Johannine Gospel, because as wonderful as the beloved disciple was, we now find Jesus placing Peter over the beloved disciple. It is Peter who is to carry on with the disciples the tradition of Jesus. In fact, at the very end here, Jesus says to Peter, follow me. Okay? So now, by the time that this episode had been written, it is most likely that Peter's leadership was already being felt. But it's important perhaps in the Johannine tradition, and not only is the beloved disciple put in place, but also, sorry ladies, a little bit, after all, it had been Mary Magdalene who had announced the message of Jesus resurrected, and some saw her as maybe the kind of inspiration for following the new movement. Be that as it may, in this episode, it is Peter who is really put in that position. Goes on to say that later on they will lead you where you do not want to go, but you will be following, and some see this part is not included in our reading this time, but you can find this as the episode ends, that Peter will experience what happened to Jesus will happen to Peter. So all of that makes this a very interesting episode to look at this time as we gather together. The first reading, again, keep in mind that we're looking at the Acts of the Apostles. Picture the apostles as gladly willing to suffer dishonor because of the preaching of Jesus. The high priest is pictured as arresting the disciples. If you look at it very carefully, it's the same group who had made the death of Jesus, ordered up the death of Jesus. Of course, they had to turn him over to Pilate, but nevertheless, they tell the disciples, stop teaching, stop doing this. They don't. They will continue, and that, of course, is the episodes that unfold. We're really only in the early part of the Acts, and we will hear more about the early disciples in the unfolding weeks of the Easter time. Anyway, it is Peter, therefore, also here in this reading, who launches a short sermon. God has revealed the plan of those who put Jesus to death. They have brought dishonor upon Jesus by crucifying him, but God has raised him from the dead and exalted him to a place of honor. Now that's important, because it is true in Scripture that one who was crucified was considered to be dishonored. the Acts of the Apostle, written by Luke, of course, pictures that in Jesus being raised up, God has brought to the one who was dishonored honor, and that it is the resurrection that brings honor and glory to God. Well, thank you for being with us, and we'll hope we'll see you again.